Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, March 9th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week, Tess and Mark Szamatulski, authors of Clone Brews and Beer Captured, join us to talk about making copies. Well, of course, I mean making copies of your favorite beers. This was a fun interview, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. I certainly did. But before we get to that, I want to share a couple of emails I got following our show on adjuncts last week. Alex from Ottawa wrote and said, up here in Canada, the price of alcohol is pretty expensive in most places. That means you can't really even save money by drinking Colt 45. So the idea of getting a little more bang for your buck sounds like something worth trying sometime. He says, perhaps sometime on the show you can expand more on what Andy Sparks, was mentioning about getting rice into a gelatinous state, which I wasn't too clear on. Alex says, I'd like to try a higher than 5% beer sometime. Well, first of all, adding rice is not the only way, and many would argue not the best way at all, of getting your beer above 5%. Simply adding more fermentable sugar in the form of grain or extract will give you a higher alcohol content. But since the question was specifically about rice, I forwarded the question to Andy Sparks of thehomebrewery.com. Andy said, that's an easy one. To get rice in a gelatinous state, you simply need to cook it. Grinding the rice into smaller pieces will speed the cooking process up. If you've ever had rice that is cooked too long, you know what it means to get rice into a gelatinous state. After it gets good and gummy, you can add this to your mash. Well, thanks to Andy Sparks. And if you ever come over to my house when I'm cooking the rice, you can see exactly what he's talking about. I seem to always take it a little too far when I'm cooking it. And I know what some of you are thinking out there. To some, rice is a dirty word when it comes to beer, and I've never used it myself, but we have a big tent here at Basic Brewing, and you can choose to use or ignore the info you hear here. So there you go. Jamil Zainasheff from The Jamil Show over on the Brewing Network wrote in to comment on Irish moss. Jamil says George Fix actually did some tests on this, and in an analysis of brewing techniques, Jamil says page 122 in his copy, he discusses the effects of differing concentrations of Irish moss. Jamil says, I found much improved clarity and no fishy flavor when following his recommendations, which are about 2.5 to 3 teaspoons of Irish moss per 5-gallon batch. So that's more than we generally recommend or is generally recommended for a 5-gallon batch. Jamil continues, of course, now I use Whirlflock, but I think it's worth passing along to new brewers the amount of Irish moss that gives the optimal result. Well, I appreciate that information from Jamil. Jamil's show on the Brewing Network runs every other Monday, and he usually examines a single style of beer on each show. That's interesting, in-depth information. On another topic, Bob from Orem, Utah writes in to say, I had never heard of the concept of batch sparging until I heard your show. I should point out that while it may seem like a large time saver, there's another way to make fly sparging go much faster. Bob says by collecting the runnings directly into your heated brew pot, you can start boiling the wort almost immediately. With this method, Bob says, I'm boiling the first runnings within 10 minutes and boiling the entire volume within 40. With batch sparging, you still have to heat up the wort, which takes time. And Bob says batch sparging also seems less practical for larger grain bills. Believe me, it's no fun to re-stir 20 pounds of grain. And he concludes by saying, still, I found the concept to be fascinating. Well, that's good advice and a good point. Of course, with batch sparging, you can follow the same tactic and start to heat your first runnings while you're adding your sparge water, doing your Vorloff, and collecting your second runnings, too. But, as I always say, it's all in what you want to do and what makes you happy in your brewing process and what you find that works for you. So thanks, Bob, for the email and the advice. Okay, now on to our interview with Tess and Mark Szamatulski. They are the owners of Maltos Express Homebrew and Wine Supplies in Monroe, Connecticut, but they may be better known as the authors of Clone Brews and Beer Captured. Tess and Mark spent some time with us to let us in on how they clone the recipes of our favorite beers. Mark and Tess, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jim.
And you are, first of all, let's just get some background on you. How long have you been brewing? Have you both been brewing? Did you start brewing together? Give us some background on your brewing experience.
Let's see, I've been brewing for about 15 years. And in the beginning, I just started brewing because a friend of mine had home brewed. I had tasted a porter, which up to that point, I think I only had one dark beer in my life, probably a Guinness Stout. And I just thought it was one of the best beers I've ever tried in my life. So we started brewing, and within a few months, we started a little mail order business because it was very hard back then to find ingredients.
Wow.
And I know I brewed a stout as one of my first beers because my wife, Tess, she's a great cook, and she likes to cook with beer. So I figured I'd make the second beer a stout. And as time went on, within a year or two, and the business started to grow, and I started to get busy, Tess started doing most of the brewing.
Really?
And she's really she's a very good brewer. She's won a lot of local awards, and she's a lot better than I am.
It takes a real man to admit that.
Well, I think if he had more time, I'm sure he would be excellent at it also. It's just a time factor. But I also was a caterer, and I used beer in a lot of my dishes. And it was just getting too expensive to buy the microbrew. So Mark started, brewing beer for me, and it worked out well until I realized that I liked the beer business better than the catering business. So that's when I became a full-time Maltos Express person.
So you were enthusiastic about the hobby right in the very beginning.
Oh, absolutely, because I was drinking good beer. It's really hard not to be enthusiastic about that.
And how long ago was this?
16 years ago?
Yeah, about 15 years ago, we started brewing and started the business about 14 years ago. And after about a year, we started a storefront because we had too many people coming over the house all times of night and day, and I'm sure the neighbors were trying to figure out what exactly was going on in here.
You were dealing in something.
It was only a couple of days a week. I think it was like Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and it was a little room in the store. And eventually we ended up taking over the building, and we're open 6 days a week now and 7 days during wine season.
And what's the name of your shop, and where are you?
Yeah, we're in Monroe, Connecticut, and it's called Maltos Express.
And doing well, I guess.
Yeah, we've done well. And not only do we sell ingredients for making beer, we sell ingredients for making wine, and meat as well. But wine's really taken off, a lot in the last few years, as well as the beer making. So
what if you don't mind my asking, about what percentage is beer and what percentage is wine, just for curiosity's sake?
In the beginning it was 100% beer and 0% wine. And I'd have to say now we're probably about 60% wine and 40% beer.
Really?
Yes.
Really? Wow. And what do you credit that to?
A long time ago you really couldn't get a real good beer. It was hard to get a good beer in the United States. But we did our first book, when we did clone brews, we had to go to Europe and bring beers back. Anytime a friend went anywhere, we had him bring back beers, whether it was just driving somewhere or flying to a different state, because you couldn't get a variety of good beers here in Connecticut. As time's gone on, a lot of importers are importing a lot of the beers that we brought back, and it's easier to get good beer now. So a lot of people used to brew beer just because they couldn't get a real good beer, and now they can. For winemaking, you can make a real nice wine, and it's very inexpensive. You can still make a real nice bottle of wine for $2 a bottle. So I know a lot of the people who started off brewing beer make wine now because they can get a good beer in the store, but they can brew the wine, not actually brew, but they can ferment the wine they want and make the wine they want for an inexpensive price. And
you mentioned being able to get imported good beers. American beers are also good on their own now. So.
Oh yeah, it's there's such a variety now with all the microbreweries out there and the people that home brew. It's amazing.
Now the first book that you guys did was Clone Brews.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And Tess, tell us about how that came about and when that came about.
Well, I can tell you exactly. One night, Mark and I were in the store, and we just said, we've got to go somewhere else with this, because people would come in and they would ask us for recipes like, I'd like to make a Bass Ale, I'd like to make a Guinness. And what we would do is we would just give them recipes to make this. And we realized that people were asking for commercial beers because there was a reason for it, because they were brewed to style. And the reason why they're brewed to style is because the styles are good. They've come down and through ages, and the styles are really the backbone of brewing. And so we said, you know what, just for the heck of it, we see all these recipe books out. We said, why don't we just call, we could write a recipe book. So we said, we'll just call Story Publications and see if they want to do a book. So we did, and amazingly, they said sure. So that's how we got our first book. And with the title, basically what we were doing is cloning beers, cloning commercial beers, and that's how we got the Clone Brew title.
Did you know what you were getting into when you came up with the idea? Did you know?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I mean, it was amazing how things evolved.
And the first book has 150 recipes, and the second book has 150 beer recipes as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, my first question was, how in the world do you have time to do 150 recipes? And you told me in an earlier conversation that each one of these recipes is tested.
Yes.
How do you do it?
If we did not own a homebrew store, we couldn't do it because we brew beers, but also our customers brew beers for us. So basically, they say, oh, is there a beer that you want me to brew? And we give them the recipe. They brew the beer. Then they come back and we taste it against the commercial example, and we tweak it, and either they will brew it again or we'll brew it.
So you've got a network of testers.
Absolutely, and these are all really, really fine brewers. And a lot of times the way we find beers to go in the book is because people have been somewhere and said, hey, this is a really great beer, try it, see if it's worthy of your book. And a lot of times we do, and it is, and they brew it. They're more than happy to brew it because they have 5 gallons of beer that they love, and we get someone to brew our recipe for us.
And what did you learn between the first book, between Clone Brews and Beer Captured? What did you learn?
We really perfected our palate, and Mark perfected he wrote a program with basically the colors of the malts and the IBUs of the hops, and that was a big help to us. And also it helped us made us a little more credible that if we needed information from brewers or breweries, that since we did have a first book, some of them were more willing to help us out.
So Mark, did you get a lot of cooperation with the breweries that you were talking to?
For the first book, we get some information from people. When we did the first book, it was a while ago. We worked on that probably in 1996, 1997. The internet wasn't a big thing yet. There wasn't a lot of information on the internet. So we would call people, and we'd call people from Africa. It was hard. The first book, the whole thing was to have a beer from almost every country or beers from all around the world. So it wasn't really the style. And if you look at the first book, there's a lot of lagers and white lagers in the first book because they drink a lot of white lagers all around the world. As we started moving on for the second book, we did get some more cooperation from people. Like Yingling sent us their porter and the recipe.
Wow.
And I know that, a brewery up in Vermont that makes...
Jasper Murdoch's Whistling Pig.
Yeah, Jasper Murdoch's, the brewer there, did the same thing. He gave us the recipe. A lot of times people don't give us anything. They'll say, yes, we have 10 different spices in this beer. The older breweries tend to guard their recipes more.
Especially the Belgians.
Right, and the Canadians.
Yeah, that's like the Colonel giving away his 11 herbs and spices. What?
The thing is, a lot of the brewers realize that home brewers are the biggest market for microbrewed beers. Just because they homebrew doesn't mean they're never going to go out and buy microbrew beers. They are because of their love of beer. And when their recipes are in the book, it basically is advertising for them. For example, there's this one Belgian beer that's in Beer Captured called Beacon that we found over in Belgium and cloned, and then all of a sudden it's in the U.S. now. It's being imported to the U.S. So, we're very happy that people can, finally taste it. But some of the brewers are very, very, very helpful, and they realize that we're not trying to steal their recipe, and some are very secretive. And then we just say, okay, well, we'll do it ourselves then.
Well, I've found with limited exposure of talking to professional brewers that there seems to be a cooperative climate between a lot of the smaller ones, especially, of kind of working together, and it seems like it's in everybody's best interest to kind of spread that cooperation, and what's good for beer is good for everybody.
And that is true, and especially in Connecticut where we live, there are some breweries here and brewers, and it actually helps. Everybody's in it together, and we help the breweries help us, and it's like a network, and it's really nice because it's not a competition. It's people who love beer just working together to promote the love of beer.
Now, what are the most popular recipes that were requested to go in these books?
Belgians. Absolutely, hands down, Belgians.
And why is that, you think?
Because they're so diverse. They're delicious. They've got a broad range, and they're wonderful to cook with.
And does it seem like they're mysterious in a way? And
they're very mysterious because what they do is the Belgians guard their yeast. So the yeast that they use to ferment their beer, they are going to use a different strain to bottle condition their beer just so their yeast won't be stolen by other breweries.
And that's one thing that I want to talk about. In your books, it's not just a recipe book. You do go through techniques of how to harvest yeast from a bottle of beer, and talk a bit about that.
Some of the yeast, they do use the same strain, so you are able to harvest the yeast, make a starter, up the starter, and use it to ferment the beer. But now the yeast people have really perfected and increased their strains of yeast. So basically, you don't really have to do that anymore. Like, for example, Y Yeast recently came out with a couple of new yeasts. They came out with the Roselaire yeast, the Bière de Garde yeast from Soy, Belgium, their Farmhouse Ale from Belgium, and all these are strains that the breweries actually use, so they're making your homebrew more credible.
But some of it is geek factor. It's not just that you can go out and buy the yeast. If you can harvest the yeast from a bottle of beer, that's, you get a scout badge for that.
You do, but it's not necessarily the same yeast that they use to ferment the beer. Mm-hmm. So it will have some of the same characteristics, but it's not exactly the same strain.
But if you can find those beers that do use the same strain, and then that's something to brag about at the next club meeting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you see, sometimes homebrewers try to, sneak back yeast from Belgium and things like that. We've had a couple of our customers do that. So, it's really interesting. It's really a very, very varied hobby.
So what is the strategy in cloning a beer? I know Mark, you've got a computer program now, but before you had the computer program, what was your strategy of, do you taste the beer and just start off with, how do you do it?
In the very beginning, we'd find a beer and we'd try it. You try the beer, you look at it for color, look at the head, try to get the color of the head. The color of the head can tell you if there's roasted grains in there or not. The color of the beer can tell you how many SRMs of color and what type of grains were used. We'd smell the beer for trying to get hops, taste it, trying to get the flavor of the hops, trying to get the flavor of any spices that may be in there. And we sort of did them one by one when we first started off. As we moved on to the second book, we gather a number of different beers of one style, and we tried to go more by style for the second book. I mean, the first book, we'd be lucky to get a bottle of something. We'd get a bottle, we'd pour 7 ounces into a little 7-ounce bottle so we could compare it later on to what we made, and we'd sip about 2 ounces each. As time went on, it was easier to get beers. We'd line up maybe 6 or 8 glasses with 6 or 8 beers of a certain style. And on some beers, you'd know a little information. Other beers, maybe you wouldn't know any information, but maybe some you'd know color, and some you would know IBUs. And it gave you a nice way to compare beers to each other. Once we did our tastings, we'd know the color of the head, the color of the beer, the bitterness, what the apparent bitterness was. We measure the final gravity. We try to figure out what the original gravity was. Usually you know. And then I just put it into my program. And for the first book, we wanted to get a little more technical. And when we first started brewing, we really didn't keep stats at all. But for the book, for people to know if they were in the right ballpark, especially when we started going to all grain and like mini mash recipes, we had to make a program to make all 3 styles come out the same. And I tried a bunch of the programs out there, and none of them really hit it on the head. So after fooling around on the computer for a few months, I finally came up with something that was very close in all 3 styles: extract, mini mash, and all grain. And what we ended up doing was we put everything in the program, make that recipe, then taste it against the original, and then we tweak it. And in tweaking it in the beginning, I tweaked both my program and the beer recipe. And now the program's, it's been set for about 4 years, and it helps us to make all the beers. Tess is a great nose, so she's great at spices. She's great at flavor. I'm a little colorblind, so she's great at color. So pretty much I drink the beer and type, and she does most of the work.
So I take it you're a computer guy.
I work with computers, yes. So it was easy to make the program up.
So Tess has got the nose and the taste buds.
Absolutely.
But I mean, did you call upon other people in your crowd of friends who could pick out certain spices or certain hops or certain characteristics of the beer?
Yeah, sometimes, you know what we do, after we've made the beer in particular, we'll sample at our store with other people. You know, a lot of beer judges, people that work with us or for us, or just customers that come in that know a lot about a beer. In between all of us, sometimes that really helps. They all pick out something a little different. Maybe someone knows that things are like a little caramelized, or they'll pick up something that we won't.
And you get a lot more friends that way, too.
Oh, sure. It's a beer drinking club.
And you're working. So.
Absolutely. It's hard work, but someone has to do it.
Now, what are the toughest beers to clone?
For the toughest beers for me to do, it may have been different for Tess, but some beers you make right away. You give me an English ale, give me an IPA. We could, when we were when you're really going and you're making a book, you're tasting beers every day, you can make that beer in one try. I had a hard time with Belgian doubles. I just had the hardest time with Belgian doubles because Belgian doubles, they have rock candy in there that don't really give you any color. They have very hard grains that are hard to extract the color from for a brewer doing home brew. They were very hard for us. Some of the Belgian beers are just impossible because you can't get their yeast. But what we'll try to do is we'll get the gravity, we'll get the bittering, we'll put the closest yeast we can in there and hope that it works out. And if we're making a beer, the hardest beer to make is definitely an Oktoberfest, because it seems like you always have to do a decoction mash to really get that great Oktoberfest nutty malty flavor. And it's hard to do that with an extract. Mm-hmm. So we've had our trouble with certain beers, but I know definitely for me, it was Belgian doubles. And once in a while too, you're trying to make a beer that's huge in alcohol. They artificially carbonate these beers in the brewery, and you're trying to make a 12% alcohol beer. Your yeast keeps dying, so you're trying to give people a way to make that beer, without going to extraordinary means. So those are pretty hard, too, trying to get people to carbonate the barley wines properly.
And you always have to have the eye toward the home brewer.
Oh, absolutely. And we know what goes in a beer, but we don't always put every ingredient in the home brew version because we want it to be something somebody can make at home. If the brewer uses 12 hops, on a 5-gallon scale, or like you were saying, on a 6-bottle scale, you can't throw in 12 hops. Mm-hmm. So you're going to throw in the prominent hops. You're going to throw in what makes it easy for a home brewer to get as close to that beer as possible. So our books have always been about, like Tessie said, making beer to style, because style is developed because that's what tastes good. When I first started brewing, I just throw anything in to make this 10% brown ale. I said, yeah, this is a great beer. But it wasn't according to any style, so when you get within the style range, you can move a little bit around, but it really makes your beer a lot better.
So how is the first book different from the second book?
The second book's much better, honestly. We included a lot of things that were cut out of the first book. Mark made up this great water treatment chart, which I think is probably the best part of the book, where a home brewer doing a 5-gallon batch can actually alter the water to mimic the place that the beer was from, and water treatment improves the beer dramatically. I mean, it could, separate a beer from a regular beer to a contest-winning beer. And it's he makes it very easy to treat your water with just 4 simple ingredients, and it's made a big difference in brewing, I think. And our customers have told us that also.
I think, too, by the second book, we had gotten better. We have more directions. We've gotten a lot of feedback from the first book, so we know what customers, people that bought the book liked. We try to pay more attention to mashing and other things. Because we published the second book ourselves, half the text didn't get cut out like it did in the first book. The first book, they were very interested in making it into a nice, neat little form. And when we saw what was actually going to be published, we were quite shocked, and we begged them to put a little more in. They even cut out all the yeast in some of the recipes, and we had to beg, oh, please put the yeast back in. When we made the second book, we know what people want. We made the book bigger. We put in, all the yeast. We put in the serving suggestions, hints on how to make the beer. All the things they had cut out of the first beer, we made sure we put in the second book.
Now, before we get too far away from the, you talked about the water treatment tables.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about what's in the back of the book. I mean, you've got a whole bunch of reference materials in the back of the book. It's not, like I say, it's not just recipes.
Right.
You've got a whole bunch of information in the back of the book.
Well, see, we thought we put that in because it's important, because even though our recipes are to style, we want people to use the recipes as a springboard. Like, let's say if they liked an IPA, but they said, gee, I really would like a little more bitter, they can make it more bitter. This way they can also see, if they can't get a hop at their homebrew store, they can see what they can substitute, and they can actually see what the different grains do and things like that. But and also, you need the BJCP style guidelines. So if you are entering a beer, you can see where you're going to put it. But the hop charter is also very important too, because it gives you the range of the alpha acids and also substitutions for it if you cannot get that hop.
Just like in regular cooking, if you don't have a certain ingredient in the refrigerator or the pantry, you can grab something else.
You can substitute, absolutely.
And speaking of, well, go ahead.
Well, I think that's important too, because some people that live in a place where they don't have a large homebrew store and they don't want a mail order, they can use what's at hand. And even though it won't be, 100% true to the recipe, it will be to style because they are using a good hop substitution.
And also, if you're brewing and your recipe calls for half an ounce of hops and you've got, a 2-ounce container left over, then, you want to know what to do with that as well.
Right, exactly.
And coming from the catering side of life, you have an influence in the back of the book as well, Tess, with your recipes. You have food recipes this time.
I really wanted to put some of those in, and eventually I wanted to write a book on cooking with beer, but we're in the process of writing our third book now, so I think I have to kind of stay focused on that and then put my cooking book aside for another day.
So that was going to be my question. What's next? You're working on a third book? Is it another beer recipe book?
Yes, it is, but this one it's going to be more expanded and beer captured. We also are going to have a chapter on our favorite recipes that are not necessarily clones, and some of our award-winning customers' recipes that are not clones, but that have won awards and that we've tasted and we know that are really good beers. And we are going to put a few mead recipes in because our mead maker population is growing dramatically, and maybe a cider or two. And then also some food. I'm going to do food recipes again, but some recipes with mead and with cider as an ingredient.
Cool. Now, what do you got? You're firm believers in the styles.
Yes.
What do you think about the American Wild Ales coming out now?
They're wild. Some of them are good, and some of them are just way over the top. And I think it's almost like a competition of who can brew the biggest, hoppiest beer. And just, some of the beers, I'm not particularly a fan of over-the-top hops. It just shoots my palate. It leaves it, it's way too bitter and way too hoppy. And I like a balanced beer. Mm-hmm. And some of them are really over the top, and some of the really high alcohol beers are really nice, but they are also very deceptive, so you have to be careful with those. And it's difficult for a home brewer to make like a 21% alcohol beer, so I don't even think you should try. But on the whole, the American microbrews have been great and varied, and they've had they've copied some of the world's great styles and brought them to America, and I think that's commendable.
And I think it's good that we're kind of pushing the envelope a little bit and challenging the status quo a bit. Because, with experimentation, you come out with new stuff that then becomes the standard for the next generation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you could tell that a lot of home brewers or former home brewers are now brewers because there has been a big surge, like you said, in new types of beers, Imperial Pilsners, Imperial IPAs. One of the guys that works with us has an Imperial Scotch Ale, of all things. I mean, you just keep, you try different things.
And what you said about balance, I think, is extremely important. I mean, you can have a beer with 100 IBUs, but if it's balanced with the right amount of malt, it's not going to blow you away.
Right.
Whereas you can have a beer with 30 IBUs, and if it's lightly malted, it can taste more bitter. So
absolutely,
it's all about the balance.
To me, it is. To me, it's not shock value. It's definitely being able to finish a glass of beer that you pour. And some of the beers that I've tasted, there's no way I could even take another sip because my palate is absolutely shot. So I personally don't find that enjoyable. But I'm sure some people do because there is a market for that. Because obviously there's beers out there that have stayed out there because there's a demand for them.
My wife, I like the IPAs, but my wife calls them vomit beers. And not because they taste like vomit, but it's because at the end of when she swallows, there's that bitter taste in the back of her throat that reminds her of of throwing up, I guess. So, it's not like the beer tastes exactly like vomit. It's just that feeling, that cloying kind of,
Sure. And some people are not really fond of bitter hops, and then it's best to stay away from those beers and go for the more malt accented ones.
There's enough beer out there for everybody.
Oh, there is, absolutely.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
Yeah, there is one thing I'd like to say. At our store, and I think more and more homebrew stores are doing this, we package up recipes from both clone brews and beer captured. We crush the grain, we measure out the hops. There's a liquid yeast included with that, and it makes it nice because people can actually, we do a big mail order business, but people can actually call up and say, hey, can I have a Tommyknocker Maple Nut Brown? And they're not going to have leftover hops. They're not going to have leftover grain or maple syrup or anything. Everything is measured out. It's almost like a cake mix. But this way, they don't have all these things sitting around going to waste and then one day saying, I've got all this stuff and throwing it into one big beer, which sometimes turns out good, but sometimes doesn't.
So they call up and order a couple of cases to go, but some assembly required.
No assembly required. We assemble it. So they're just clone kits, and all they have to do is brew it.
Yeah, well, that was the assembly I was talking about.
Oh, okay.
All the parts are there. You just got to put them together.
Put them together. Absolutely.
Which is the fun part.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know in the next book we're going to do as well, we're still going to have clone brews, clone beers in the first part of the book, and probably 150 again, but before each style, we want to write a little bit about the style, and not just about the style, but about how to brew the style. Because certain styles, you have to pay attention to certain things. Like I was saying, Oktoberfest, you really have to do some kind of decoction mash on them. Belgian beers, you want to ferment at certain temperatures. There's a little trick, and we want to try to put our experience in from having a store all these years. And when we get to the back of the book, we want to put in things that we've brewed, we've made for people over the years. Like we have a lot of, well, not a lot, but we have quite a few people that make gluten-free beers because they have allergies to wheat or gluten. So we're going to put some gluten-free recipes in there. And these are things that you develop over time. You develop with your customers. So it's nice. It's nice to get something like that in a book so you could spread it around.
Well, very good. Well, listen, I appreciate your time. I'm happy that we were able to finally link up.
So are we.
Yeah, you're very nice to talk to. It's been a really enjoyable time.
Well, thanks again to Tess and Mark Szamatulski. And once again, their books are Clone Brews and Beer Captured. Hope we can talk to them again someday. That was fun. Well, next week I hope to have a first look at Brian Warren's experiment in hot side aeration. Keep your fingers crossed on that one. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And if you're wanting to get into home brewing, while you're on our site, you can check out our DVD, Basic Brewing, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing. We'll walk you through the process step by step. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVD, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. And stay tuned for our all-grain DVD coming very soon. But that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.